Hello. This watercolor skill builder video is going to focus on understanding how to create an illusion of space in a painting using watercolors. So to help us kind of understand what we want to accomplish, I've got a handout here from artclasscurator.com that kind of breaks down and talks a little bit about what space is and how we try to depict space in an artwork to make an artwork look a little bit more realistic. So if we read here, space is how an artwork uses or depicts depth or distance. So when we think about creating a painting, our painting is going to be flat in 2D, but we want to think about how can we make it look like we have things that are really far away and things that are really close to us. And so we're going to think in terms of three different layers of space. We have a background, a middle ground, and a foreground. So if we look at this image here, titled South Beach Bathers by John Sloan, this painting utilizes the three different layers of space. So your background is going to include this layer all the way here at the top, where the water and the sky is, and that's everything that is farthest away from us. So it is at the top of the page. Things in the background are farthest away, and they're usually located near the top. Your foreground is going to include all those things that are closest to you. So all the people kind of lounging here near the bottom of the page, those would be considered in your foreground. And then the middle ground is going to include everything in between your background and your foreground. So all of the people here kind of playing in the water and at the water's edge and standing would be considered part of our middle ground. So for this particular painting, we're going to focus on nothing but value. Okay, so value is the lightness and darkness of a color. You're going to create a painting that is one single color, and our goal is going to be to create really, really light values. We're going to build up and have some medium values, and then we're going to include some dark values as well. So using different values in different layers of space is going to help you create an illusion of distance. We're also going to use a technique called overlapping. So with overlapping, you are going to make things that are closer to you cover or partially cover things that are farther away from you. Okay, so our objects in the foreground closest to us are going to be our darkest value, and they may partially cover or overlap things in the middle ground, and which will be a slightly lighter value, and then things all the way back here in the background are going to be our lightest value. So let's get started on the painting. You're going to need a couple things. So first, make sure you have all your supplies assembled. You're going to need a 4x6 sheet of watercolor paper. Tape that down to a scrap sheet, folder, or something heavier. You are going to want your watercolor paints. You are going to want a water cup full of water. You're probably going to want a towel or a paper towel to blot out your paintbrush, and you're going to want a paintbrush. Okay, I think I'm primarily going to use a large paintbrush, so a number 10. If you think you're going to want a smaller paintbrush to paint smaller details, you might use a number 4 as well. So to start out with, we're going to pick a color. You can use any color you want. I'm going to use violet. And we're just going to create an all over even wash for the background. So to create your wash, remember, add some water to your paper so that the entire paper is damp. And we do this so that everything will spread evenly across the page. Load your brush with some pigment and then add that and spread that out. Now, our goal is to make this color in the background as light as possible. So as you can see, I'm a little bit too dark. Okay, so if that happens, hopefully we know and recall the way to make things lighter is to add more water. So if I dip my paintbrush in the water, clean it out, and then blot the paintbrush in my towel, I can go back and use my paintbrush to kind of pull and lift out some of that pigment, and that's going to lighten this. So another thing you can do to kind of remedy and rectify this problem, if this happens as you are painting, is try not to use quite so much pigment. So if you start off by just using a little bit of paint or pigment, it's always easier to go darker with your paint. It's a little bit more difficult, as you can see in this example, to get lighter. Okay, so I think that's light enough. So now that I've got a really light all over value in the background, this needs to dry before we can move on to the next step. So I'm going to stop and pause. I'm going to step away to use a hand dryer to dry this, and then I'll come back and explain how you do your first layer of space and your first object in the background. Okay, so my paper is dry, and if you recall, the reason we want this to be dry is we're not going to be able to get crisp lines if we paint on a wet paper. So with each step of this, you're going to have to stop, you're going to have to dry your paper and make sure that it's dry before you add the next layer of space. We are going to work from background to foreground. So with watercolor paint, if you want to create any type of distance, my strongest recommendation is to work from your lightest colors first, darkest colors last, and then work your way from background to foreground. So paint everything farthest away from you first, and then start working your way forward and lower on the page so that you do your darkest colors and your things closest to you last. So at this point in the painting, you need to decide what you want to paint. I have decided to paint a cityscape. So I pulled up an image of a city with some buildings. And because I'm going to do a cityscape and I know I'm going to create some layers of space where I've got things far away and things closer, you're also going to decide, how do you want your paper turned? Do you want to do a painting that's more horizontal, or do you want to do one that's more vertical? So because I'm doing a cityscape and I really want to create the illusion that my buildings are tall, I think a vertical format is going to work best. Now, the other thing that we're going to do, that I'm going to demonstrate, is because we want to work from light to dark, we want to create some light values. And so you may need to mix colors in the lid of your paint tray to get the colors you need, because this just kind of has some basic colors. This doesn't really include like dull colors or dark colors or light colors. And we know that we make colors lighter by adding water. So all I've done is added several scoops of water, just dip my paintbrush in the water and then dip it in the lid. And then I've added some violet paint to that. Okay, so I want this to be real light. The other thing for you to keep in mind is when you've got color down, even if I use the exact same color, once something dries and I add another layer of color to that, it's automatically going to appear darker. So I'm going to start off back here, and I'm just going to paint in, just using, if you would like to use a reference photo as a guide, I recommend it. It's always good to have a visual image of what it is you want to paint to look at. So I'm just going to create just some general outlines or silhouettes of skyscrapers and buildings. So like I said, a reference photo isn't necessary, but I have found that it helps me look at specific details in terms of shapes and how I want things to look. So this is kind of why I would recommend you use one of those, but that's up to you. Now, this is going to be all of the buildings in the background, which means they are going to be the furthest away. So we want these buildings to appear to be a very light value. Okay, so what I've done is I've created that purple paint mixed with some water, and that's going to make this all appear very, very light. Notice how I'm also painting all the way down to the bottom of the page, because as we start to overlap, and as I decide that these buildings that are going to be closest to me in front, it'll be important just to have all of these all the way here to the bottom as we go. So I'm just going to fill this in, and then One more little layer. We'll just make this a small one down here and fill that in. Okay, so this is my background layer. This is all done in a light value. Okay, so notice how the sky is further away, so that's the lightest. This next layer of building is going to be a little bit closer, so that's next. So we need to stop at this point. We need to pause. We need to dry our paper, and then we can come back and add our next layer of space. Okay, so that layer of space is dry, and my next step is to create another value. So if you'd like, and I would recommend this, just continue to work with the same color that you have mixed. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dip my paintbrush in a little bit of water, and I'm going to try to load that with a little bit more of that violet, and I'm going to add more violet to this water that I mixed in the lid, and that's just going to make a darker or more vibrant color. And now I'm going to add another layer of buildings right here, and I'm going to paint right on top of this layer that I did before. So we don't want this to be like a super dark value. You want it just to be maybe just like your color with not super watered down, but not with anything added to it that's going to make it look darker. So this is going to be our middle ground. We want these buildings to look darker than the layer space that we added before, but it also needs to be lighter than our final layer that we're going to add after this. So this is where you want to try to make sure that as you paint this and test this, really look and decide if you need to go like slightly lighter or slightly darker. I'm just going to connect this here. So we want to make sure that we can still see some of these buildings all the way off in the distance. You may decide that you can still have some that are like much taller back here. So if I want another one that's pretty tall back here, maybe like a little pole, we don't necessarily have to be too concerned yet with how tall or how short we make things. The main thing that we're going to do to try to make sure that it looks like things are closer and things are farther away is adjust the value. So we want to make it look like these things that are closer are darker and the things that are farther away are lighter. I'm just going to do maybe one more little building here that's kind of thin. And maybe make it a little bit smaller down there. And then the last thing that we'd want to do as we paint all this is just make sure all of this that we've added, make sure it's dark enough that it kind of covers up those layers behind and it all looks like it's one uniform value. And that might be a little tricky as you start to add layers, just to make sure that everything kind of looks the same. Okay, so time to stop and pause again one more time. I'm going to dry this and then add our final layer space and paint some buildings and things here in the foreground. All right, so I think my middle ground layer is dry enough that it's not going to smudge and smear when I add my final layer of space. And so what thing that's happened is I've used quite a bit of my pigment. Now we want this to be the darkest. So one thing that I'm going to recommend you do is continue to work, here in the lid. I'm going to add a little bit more water. So I've got a little bit more paint to work with. I'm going to load my brush with more pigment of whatever color you've chosen. And for all these paintings, remember, you guys can paint whatever you want. You can use any colors you want. You can paint any subject you want. You don't have to paint a city for this. You could paint a landscape, trees. You can paint people. You can paint anything you want. Okay, our main goal and objective is to make sure that we have 3 different layers of space, and we want things to gradually get darker as they get closer to was. Okay, so now to make this a darker value, I'm going to add some black. Okay, so by adding black to this purple, I can create a really dark value of purple. So another thing that I'm going to do with this is with my image that I have found. My image has like some smaller lines, so I am switching to a smaller paintbrush just because what I have chosen to paint, I think it's going to be a little bit easier to paint. And so there, this final layer of space, we're going to add just some more buildings and details here in the foreground. And I'm also going to make it look like I can kind of see like parts of a bridge coming up here and extending through the skyline and coming here really close all the way down. Now, for this, we don't necessarily need to be concerned about making sure like some things have details and some things that don't. Very broad general shapes as far as like how you choose to depict your buildings and all of that, that will all be perfectly fine and sufficient for this. Like you don't necessarily have to paint all that kind of down there as well. You don't necessarily have to try to make like details in the foreground and no details in the background. The main point of this assignment and exercise is to really make sure that you guys understand how to do depth and distance using value as we go. So just going to kind of paint all this in here. Maybe this will actually, instead of being a bridge, maybe it'll just be like a little tower with little X's on that. So when you get to your final layer of space in your background, really make sure that everything kind of covers as evenly as possible. Make sure this definitely looks a little bit darker as you go. And then make sure that you are keeping everything as even as possible with your values. So make sure this all looks kind of the same little value as we go across here and so forth. So we'll kind of maybe include this down here. Kind of little line extends off that way. And that. Okay. And then if I'm not like super happy with how this looks, or if you want to go one step further, if you want just maybe one more layer of space. So the requirement is to do 3 or 4 layers. You're going to do a background layer with your sky, and then you're going to do some objects and items in the background, which would be this lightest value. You'll do a middle ground and you'll do a foreground. If you want to go even one step further and do something a little bit darker to fill this space down here, you can. But this is it. Okay, so this is how we create an illusion of depth and distance and how we create 3 different layers of space using value.